the summer of 1940, Great Britain was alone, fighting for her very life. Hitler had conquered France. Now his Luftwaffe would destroy the Royal Air Force and gain command of the air to pave the way for the invasion of Britain. Hitler and Air Marshal Göring, however, had underestimated the skill of the RAF, the spirit of the British, and the character of their leader, Winston Churchill.
Every trace of Hitler's footsteps, every stain of his infected and corroding fingers will be sponged and purged, and if need be, blasted through the surface of the earth.
In August, the Luftwaffe outnumbered the RAF nearly 2-1, but the British Spitfires were faster and more maneuverable. Using a new device they developed called radar, the British knew when and where the Germans were coming. They were determined to repel the invaders. Britain was alone that summer of 1940. No friend could reach her with decisive help. Nature was on Hitler's side, bright blue skies week after week for his bombers. The great land army faced the famous sea power, and most of the action was in the air. Villagers dug ditches across the fields of southern England. They made gasoline bombs with ketchup bottles and kept them on pantry shelves. From America, individuals shipped shotguns, sporting rifles, target pistols, and food. British munitions factories went 24 hours a day. Fox hunting land was spaded up for vegetables. Taxes confiscated all but a maintenance income. We were allowed one fresh egg a month. Hitler and Air Marshal Göring did not know that Britain's fighter plane force was all but finished. Another great daylight raid or two and it would have been over, the Nazis free to destroy at leisure the harbors, the defense fleets, opening the way for the invasion that Napoleon also planned but never tried. But the Germans had lost scores of bombers that September day. They gave up the huge daylight raids. They had lost their nerve. The British had not.
In July, August, and September, 40 or 50 squadrons of British fighter aircraft in the Battle of Britain broke the teeth of the German air fleet at odds of 7 or 8 to 1. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
In the summer of 1940, German U-boats destroyed British shipping almost at will. England's hopes for survival rested with 50 or 60 overage U.S. destroyers. Churchill pleaded with Roosevelt to give him the U-boat hunters. Mr. President, he wrote, in the long history of the world, this is the thing to do now.
On this 10th day of
FDR began to test public opinion, desperately seeking a way to help England and pacify American isolationists.
Founded by the first great American teacher of democracy, we send forth our prayers and our hopes to those beyond the seas who are maintaining with magnificent valor their battle for freedom.
President Roosevelt made a bold decision to bypass Congress and exchange 50 obsolete destroyers for military bases in Bermuda, Newfoundland, and the Caribbean. The old ships were spruced up and were turned over to the Royal Navy. FDR justified the destroyer transfer on the grounds that the ships were not essential to national security. The bases would be more valuable, and the deal would not involve future obligations, alliances, or a treaty. Nevertheless, it was an unneutral act.
Both Churchill and Roosevelt got something they wanted. They both got an American public commitment to aid Britain. For Churchill, this brought America a step closer toward the kind of participation he wanted. For Roosevelt, it brought the Congress, congressional opinion, pressure group, interest group opinion, a step closer to the frame of mind that he wanted.
America first, last and always.
2 days after the destroyer bases deal, the fiercely isolationist America First Committee sprang into being.
First, last and always. Everything is okay, and the roof hangs high. With fighters like Lindbergh, Wheeler and Nye.
They attacked Roosevelt for ignoring Congress, claiming the agreement was illegal and would draw America into war. Adolf Hitler that same month called off the invasion of Britain. The Luftwaffe, under the leadership of Air Marshal Goering, was unable to break the RAF. Goering would have one more chance to conquer Britain. In one of the great tactical errors of the war, instead of finishing off the crippled RAF, Hitler ordered a massive night bombing of London. On September 7th, the Blitz of London began. For 2 months, the Luftwaffe bombed London every night, hoping to destroy British morale. It seemed to those of us reporting from London that the people were changing. Ancient class distinctions seemed to blur, values altered. A landed aristocrat didn't mean much then, an airplane mechanic did. It was the ordinary people who so fascinated the single most important American in London that year. He was not the American ambassador. He was a slender, deep-eyed, deep-voiced 32-year-old reporter, Edward R. Murrow. He never slept in a shelter. He roamed the exploding streets in his little open car, tin hat on his handsome head. He talked with anti-aircraft crews, with editors, parliamentarians, with preachers and porters and cabbies. He broadcast to America night after night. He brought it all alive for Americans, the sights and sounds and smells of London besieged. In his powerful voice, as well as in the defiant cadences of Churchill, America felt the spirit of Britain and responded in its heart.
This is London. As some of you may have heard, when I was talking from Trafalgar Square shortly before midnight tonight, the London siren sounded for the third time in 24 hours, and the after-theater crowds in Piccadilly were startled by the roar of British anti-aircraft guns not far away. Screaming bombs were dropped as well as fire bombs on the London area. From a rooftop, I watched the skies over London assume a vivid red glow that changed to bright yellow as flames sped from a small area beneath. Pink smoke overhung the flames, and the crisscrossing of searchlight beams over the fire provided one of the most extraordinary spectacles London has ever seen. Over the flames, a German bomber hovered, droning noisily. Rooftops for miles around were illuminated. The dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, one of London's highest landmarks, was thrown into sharp relief. The all-clear signal was sounded in central London before the flames were completely extinguished.
An Englishman wrote, "When this is all over in the days to come, men will speak of this war and they will say, I was a soldier, or I was a sailor, or I was a pilot, and others will say with equal pride, I was a citizen of London." All of us who were Americans there felt that way, I think, that we too were citizens of London. From his bomb-proof shelter, Churchill wrote perhaps the most important letter of his life. In blunt language, he told FDR that Britain desperately needed ships, planes, guns, and ammunition, but was running out of cash to pay for it. Aboard the USS Tuscaloosa for a post-election vacation, Roosevelt would conceive of a method to answer Britain's needs. He would lend arms to Britain. Technically legal, it was a maneuver that became an obvious necessity. When the seaplane arrived carrying Churchill's urgent appeal to Roosevelt, the president acted.
There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain. No dictator No combination of dictators will weaken that determination by threats of how they will construe that determination.
The Senate held exhaustive hearings. There was bitter opposition, particularly from the America First Committee.
If you people want dictatorship, if you people want war, then the President's Lend, Lease, Give bill should be steamrolled through Congress. Approval of this legislation means war, open and complete warfare.
Of course there's a risk in any course of action, but all doubts as to what is the best thing we can do should be resolved in the one statement: how can we best keep out of war?
Well, depending on how you analyzed it, you could say that Lend-Lease would keep us out of war because we would send munitions and supplies to the Allies. They'd be stronger, they'd keep on fighting better. Or else you could say Lend-Lease will probably make it more likely that we'll get into war. And you could argue those two propositions, and there were a great deal of facts on both sides. And I finally concluded that the weight of the evidence was in favor of voting for Lend-Lease because I thought that that would increase the chances that we could stay out.
On March 8th, the Senate passed the Lend-Lease bill.
Any person who took the time to examine the Lend-Lease Act knew full well that it was a declaration of economic warfare against Germany, and probably a declaration of warfare at whatever level became necessary, a clear-cut statement that if it has to be more than economic warfare, we're willing to go that far.
The Nazi wolf pack still posed a difficult obstacle for transporting Lend-Lease supplies to England.
When the Lend-Lease Act was passed, this Lend-Lease Act, which meant that the British could have whatever we chose to give them, officially to lend them. It was a subsidy. The question next was, how was it going to be delivered? German submarine and surface raider activity on the Atlantic was increasing every day during 1941. Clearly, the Germans were mounting a massive submarine warfare and surface raider campaign to prevent American supplies from reaching Europe.
Churchill described Lend-Lease as the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. He might have singled out for praise the polyglot merchant marine crews that carried Lend-Lease to England during the grim summer of 1941. They sailed defenseless ships into wolf-pack-infested water. The undeclared war in the North Atlantic intensified after American troops occupied Iceland. President Roosevelt issued orders to the U.S. Navy to convoy American supplies as far as Iceland and to keep the sea lanes open. American neutrality was more and more taking on a warlike stance. German U-boat commanders, however, had strict orders from Hitler to avoid incidents with U.S. ships. For the moment, Germany wanted no war with America. The British, on the other hand, had a different view.
It was a British strategy to create as best they could the atmosphere and the, shall I say, the arena in which there would be an incident. Churchill desperately wanted for the United States to be involved in an incident, a fighting incident with the Germans.
American convoy escorts were the perfect targets for the would-be incident.
Let me read from one of the pieces of documentary evidence that we have of this period. And this is what I'm reading from, is a letter from Admiral Charles Little of the British Mission in Washington to the First Sea Lord in the summer of 1941. And what he says to the First Sea Lord, is as follows. The brightest hope for getting America into the war lies in the escorting arrangement to Iceland. And let us hope the Germans will not be slow in attacking them. Otherwise, I think it would be best for us to organize an attack by our own submarines, and preferably on the escort, period. Now, this, perhaps in large measure, was fantasy or whimsical musing, but it certainly was a very clear reflection of the British very strong desire to have the Americans involved in some sort of an incident that would provoke us further into the war.
On August 9th, 1941, at Argentia, off the coast of Newfoundland, Winston Churchill met for the first time with Franklin Roosevelt. The British Prime Minister visited FDR's flagship, USS Augusta. It was an emotional meeting. These two dynamic, iron-willed men had been corresponding for nearly 2 years. After 3 days of meetings, the Atlantic Charter emerged, a broad statement of equal rights for all people, but more important was the beginning of a deep personal friendship. The next day, Sunday, FDR visited the HMS the Prince of Wales. The President and the Prime Minister attended church services and sang "Onward, Christian Soldiers." Intuitively, they knew their common cause.
Roosevelt and Churchill had a number of personality characteristics in common. They were both tough-minded. They both came from an elite group who were practicing, in effect, the idea of noblesse oblige, or that nobility obligates individuals to look after those who are lesser than themselves. They were both patricians. They were both the equivalent, if you want, of 20th century democratic noblemen.
It's not so much that decisions were made at the Atlantic Conference which committed the United States to war against Germany. Maybe the best answer is the impression that the British received. It's hard to say exactly how much of a commitment Roosevelt made, but we do know that when Winston Churchill returned to London in 1941, in August 1941, he told the War Cabinet, if I may quote it, the War Cabinet report. Churchill told the cabinet that Roosevelt, quote, said that he would wage war but not declare it, and that he would become more and more provocative. Everything was to be done to force an incident. The president made it clear that he would look for an incident which would justify him in opening hostilities. Now, we can go too far with that. That sounds as if the president had committed himself to war. We can go a little too far. Britain was hanging at the edge of an abyss in August 1941. Churchill was desperate to find a ray of hope.
On September 4th, 1941, an American destroyer, the USS Greer, provided President Roosevelt with the incident he was looking for. The Greer was on a mail run to Iceland. A British patrol plane signaled that it had spotted a German U-boat. The U-boat tried to evade its pursuers. The Greer speeded up, sounded general quarters, zigzagged toward the submarine, made sonar contact, and began tracking the U-boat. After 2 hours, the submarine fired a torpedo at the unmarked Greer, thinking it was a British destroyer. The Greer began dropping depth charges and continued pursuing the U-boat for 2 more hours, dropping 11 more depth charges. The Greer tracked the U-boat a while longer. The logs of both the destroyer and the submarine indicate that it was a classic anti-submarine warfare maneuver. The destroyer was the aggressor, and the U-boat fired in self-defense. President Roosevelt used the incident to initiate the policy of shoot on sight. The Cold War in the Atlantic was over.
In spite of what Hitler's propaganda bureau has invented, in spite of what any American obstructionist organization may prefer to believe, I tell you the blunt fact that the German submarine fired first upon this American destroyer, Greer, without warning and with deliberate design to sink her. When you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he has struck before you crush him. These Nazi submarines and raiders are the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic.
From what we know now, it was an act of deception, given at both the congressional and the public level. Whatever the goodness of the cause, the rightness of it, of the objectives, it was in fact, it was a distortion, an important distortion of the facts, of the truth.
I would argue that there was a public and a private FDR, and that the public FDR was deceptive, devious, lacked candor, dissembled, whatever word you'd like to use. Occasionally, he lied, yes. But that's not quite the same as saying that people didn't know what direction he was going in.
It was an occasion, it was a reason, it was the moment for Roosevelt to move to unrestricted convoying and to an unrestricted naval war at sea, which lasted from that day to Pearl Harbor.
On October 31st, 1941, a German U-boat torpedoed the USS Reuben James, killing over 100 members of the crew. The attack signaled the end of American neutrality, and the country edged closer to war.
Have you heard of a ship called the good Reuben James? Manned by hard-fighting men, both of honor and fame. She flew the stars and stripes of this land of the free. Tonight she's in her grave on the bottom of the sea. Tell me what was their names, tell me what was their names. Did you have a friend on that good Reuben James? What was their names, tell me what was their names. Did you have a friend on that good Reuben James?
Winnie and Franklin, such they were to each other. Patricians with a sense that their positions obligated them to help others. These two men altered the course of history. Churchill and Roosevelt knew that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and they knew that their countries together could defeat Nazi Germany. Apart, each might sink. As Churchill said, this is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Target pistols and food. British munitions factories went 24 hours a day. Fox hunting land was spaded up for vegetables. Taxes confiscated all but a maintenance income. We were allowed one fresh egg a month. Hitler and Air Marshal Goering did not know that Britain's fighter plane force was all but finished. Another great daylight raid or two and it would have been over, the Nazis free to destroy at leisure the harbors, the defense fleets, opening the way for the invasion that Napoleon also planned but never tried.
But the Germans had lost scores of bombers that September day. They gave up the huge daylight raids. They had lost their nerve. The British had not.
In July, August, and September, 40 or 50 squadrons of
In the summer of 1940, Great Britain was alone, fighting for her very life. Hitler had conquered France. Now his Luftwaffe would destroy the Royal Air Force and gain command of the air to pave the way for the invasion of Britain.
British fighter aircraft in the Battle of Britain broke the teeth of the German air fleet at odds of 7 or 8 to 1. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
In the summer of 1940, German U-boats destroyed British shipping almost at will. England's hopes for survival rested with 50 or 60 overage U.S. destroyers. Churchill pleaded with Roosevelt to give him the U-boat hunters. Mr. President, he wrote, in the long history of the world, this is the thing to do now. Hitler and Air Marshal Goring, however, had underestimated the skill of the RAF, the spirit of the British, and the character of their leader, Winston Churchill.
Every trace of Hitler's footsteps, every stain of his infected and corroding fingers will be sponged and purged, and if need be, blasted through the surface of the earth.
In August, the Luftwaffe outnumbered the RAF nearly 2 to 1. But the British Spitfires were faster and more maneuverable. Using a new device they developed called radar, the British knew when and where the Germans were coming. They were determined to repel the invaders.
Britain was alone that summer of 1940. No friend could reach her with decisive help. Nature was on Hitler's side, bright blue skies week after week for his bombers. The great land army faced the famous sea power, and most of the action was in the air. Villagers dug ditches across the fields of southern England. They made gasoline bombs with ketchup bottles and kept them on pantry shelves. From America, individuals shipped shotguns, sporting rifles,